Good morning. Storm clouds gathering. Top of the morning to you. Recently, you made a video called "After American Collapse, What Comes Next?" It's a good cold beer. Well, in this video, you asked for someone to make a video response, and here it is. And I'm going to do it as such. I'm going to pick a little spot here and play what you produced.
Concept. The non-aggression principle is the only way that communities of humans can live together without becoming totalitarian. Now, if the non-aggression principle is agreed upon between the communities, then those communities can grow into federations which exchange resources and provide for common defense. You can think of these like states in our current system, except that member groups would be much smaller, much more autonomous, and there would be no central power like the federal government imposing its will over the group. If you organize like this, then you wouldn't need to come up with a single right way to live. We could each choose how we want to live and let others choose what they want. If the community down the road wants to try out socialism, then great, have at it, as long as they don't try to push it on their neighbors. If you really think about it, this is the only sane way to organize when a population is culturally divided. An additional benefit of this approach is that rather than monoculturing culture, which is what we do right now, you would actually have a choice. You would have real diversity of systems, and we could let these experiments play themselves out and find out what works. And maybe, just maybe, somebody will come up with something that works better than what we have right now. What I'm talking about here is dealing with culture the way we deal with technical inventions. When something works, it's imitated. When something fails, we don't all have to repeat those mistakes. The problem with our current paradigm is we force everybody into the same experiment. So when one experiment fails, the whole system fails. Now, I've tried to come up with a label for this concept. I've considered the term federated voluntarism and voluntary federationism. To be honest, both of them sound a little bit clumsy to me. What are your thoughts? How would you rebuild? My challenge to you is to answer in a video response, but with one condition. You have to answer the question of how you would deal with people who don't want to go down the same path. Would you use violence to force those people to comply? Would you create a system of law enforcement to have others carry out that violence for you? Be honest here. Don't skirt around the question. Bonus points.
All right. How would I deal with people that would not go down the same path? I would deal with them peacefully. I wouldn't force my will upon them if they weren't damaging my life, my family's life, or my property. If I was not aggressed upon, I would not aggress in kind. The non-aggression principle, correct? All right. If they didn't want to live in my society, which would be an anarcho-capitalist society, I would say, fine, go live your own fucking life, and don't bother me. So, you were having problems naming what you were thinking about. Thomas E. Woods Jr. I'll pull it up here. It has a little spiel on Mises University on the iTunes podcast or whatever, and this one little bit I'm going to play for you should answer that. It's in the Politically Incorrect Guide to American History lecture series, and specifically the Secession and the American Experience at the 18-minute 44-second mark. Here you go.
To the work of a man I'm privileged to call my friend, Donald Livingston of Emory University, who has identified one of these larger issues that was at stake in the war that so often is overlooked. Livingston points out that in the modern age we have seen what Livingston, for lack of a better term, calls federative polities, which I'll get to that in a minute, giving way to modern states. What is a federative polity and what is a modern state? A federative polity is one in which a variety of smaller jurisdictions exist, like families, voluntary organizations, towns and states, and in medieval Europe, institutions like guilds, universities, and the church. Each of these social authorities has powers and rights of its own that the central government cannot overturn. Each of them is also a potential source of corporate resistance to the central government. Prior to the rise of the modern state, political leaders who desired centralization therefore found themselves up against the historic liberties of towns, guilds, universities, the church, and similar corporate bodies. Now today we live at a time when people have been taught to disparage all things medieval as primitive, backward, and oppressive, which, by the way, is a view that no medievalist worth his salt would adopt today. But it was in the federated polities of medieval Europe that the Western practice of liberty began to take root. It is significant that following the dissolution of the Roman Empire, no continent-wide empire took its place. Ralph Raico, who's a historian associated with the Institute, points out that instead of experiencing the hegemony of a universal empire, Europe evolved into a mosaic of kingdoms, principalities, city-states, ecclesiastical domains, and other entities. A long line of scholars have argued that it was the decentralized nature of European political life, beginning in the Middle Ages, that contributed to the development of liberty. The multiplicity of jurisdictions meant that the prince risked losing population and therefore his tax base if he engaged in excessive taxation or interference in his people's economic lives. They could simply move to another political unit close by if their own became too oppressive. The very idea of sovereignty, according to which every political order must possess a single irresistible voice, competent and forceful enough to make its will felt throughout society, was essentially alien to medieval thought and practice. Institutions other than the central government possessed rights that no sovereign, whether a king or a democratic majority, could simply overturn at will. So that is the concept of a federated polity. Thomas Hobbes, on the other hand, set out parameters for what Livingston calls the modern state in his book Leviathan in 1651, that developed into unexamined premises that later thinkers took for granted. The modern state, about which Hobbes theorized, is one in which the central government is absolutely supreme, and in which society is thought of as being composed not of independent social authorities, as in a federated polity, but of a simple aggregate of individuals. There are no truly independent social authorities in the modern state because nothing is thought to be independent of or prior to the central government.
And of course that line of thinking metastasized, if you will, in the thoughts of Fichte and Hegel, which were in the old kingdom of Prussia. And it's Hans Hermann Hoppe wrote a book called Democracy, the God That Failed. And it kind of, I mean, I've only thumbed through it, I haven't read it cover to cover. But I'm working my way to it. It's a lot of stuff to read. In the Prussian Empire, it basically wasn't, in that era, it wasn't the centralized German state that we see now, or that we saw under Bismarck, but and Hitler, of course. But it was just a conglomeration, you know, a federal polity, which is the term Woods uses here, as just a bunch of city-states and different churches and guilds and landowners that would have had mutual defense alliances and whatnot. And of course there was always the rogue city-state that wanted to aggress upon another and create conflict and whatnot. but we didn't have massive continent-wide wars during that time, like there was previously under the Roman Empire, so to speak. But yes, federal polity. What would I do if people didn't want to go along with what I wanted to? I'd say, well, you know, that's fine. Get the fuck off my land. And by the way, have you heard of the Blue Seed Project being proposed by Milton Friedman's grandson, I believe? We're basically just creating city-states on the open sea. The Seasteading Institute, I believe, is what he is involved in now. But anyways, yes. And in terms of defending your little polity, if you want to call it that, or whatever, I mean, it'd be a combination of a tyrannicide and mark and reprisal. A writ of mark and reprisal. Say a foreign politician casts a yes vote to invade or wage war against your peoples, then go ahead and put a bounty on his head to the man that takes care of your enemy for you, and if not the man, leave that funds that he would have gotten with his family. And of course, it would be nice. I bet Gaddafi, when he was in that bunker, before he got in that caravan where we saw him take the 9mm to the head, I bet when he was jumping in that caravan, he wished he had a nuclear weapon. So, it's all food for thought and whatnot. So, yeah. Alright, guys, take it easy.